From the archives of the great library of Arathes, Golden City of Elves, the wise scholars of Grey Sage present the unlikely and highly questionable accounts from those who were avowed witness. These are the suspenseful investigations of the human, Fraenk Neversleep, Arch-Preceptor of Blackroot. And now, the Neversleep Scrolls, Circle of the Mind Thief, written by Philip Walton. The story continues. Chapter 37. A collective gasp went up, and High Lord Whiteleaf recoiled, cradling his hand like it had been bitten. There was a long, terrible moment where Fraenk and the High Lord stood staring at one another, both in equal amounts of surprise. The entire room was so quiet that all Fraenk could hear was Lady Blackroot's final admonition that if he got in trouble she would not come to his rescue. And now, what was the first thing he did when he was left unsupervised? Slap the young ruler of the entire region. Well, perhaps they'd give him a swift death. High Lord Crispin Whiteleaf's face suddenly burst into a smile, and he began to laugh. It was an infectious, high, clear sound that made Fraenk also grin. Frank's smile curdled when he saw the hate glares from the contingent of house guards that were now forming a menacing semicircle that was closing in around the two men. "I'm so sorry, my lord," Fraenk said, bowing low, hoping he looked appropriately contrite. His entire course on how high lordly courtesies and behaviours from their own Acheron of ceremonies had completely flown from his head. On the bright side, the High Lord didn't seem offended at all. He was absolutely giddy.
"You are a human, yes?"
"Yes, my lord, Arch-Preceptor Fraenk Neversleep, at your humble service," Fraenk said quickly, bowing again for good measure. He made sure to leave out that he was from Blackroot District. No sense in having his lady involved in whatever dark fate awaited him.
"How delightful!"
the High Lord exclaimed, still beaming with a brilliant smile.
"I've never met a real human before. Your ears really are rounded, as they say. Fascinating."
"That's right, my lord." Fraenk looked up at him, suddenly struck by what the High Lord said. "Wait, you've never met a human?"
"You are my first."
Lord Whiteleaf examined him with bright, inquisitive eyes, like one might marvel at an exotic bird or one of the baby Shivan cubs that travelled in cages with the touring curiosity caravans out of Gazir Gazon. It was an uncomfortable feeling, to be sure, but better than him being dragged off to be executed for assaulting the High Lord.
"I have so many questions,"
High Lord Whiteleaf said.
"What do you like to eat? How do things sound in your round ears? Why is your body so thick? Is it hard to move?"
Now that he had recovered from the initial shock, Fraenk was acutely aware that here he was, speaking plainly with none other than the most famous and private elf in the entire region, the so-called Boy King, High Lord Crispin Whiteleaf himself. But he was no boy like the rumours had suggested. Whiteleaf appeared to be an adult elf in his 30s, which was young in terms of the hundreds of years that elves lived, but he was still a grown man. He was quite handsome, and his body thin and slender like most elves. He had an intense but not unpleasant gaze, and his demeanour seemed rather excitable and enthusiastic, but how could one blame him, apparently having only seen fellow elves his entire life? And that little detail itself struck Fraenk as odd. Roughly half the population of the city of Arathes was human, and he had never encountered a single one. They really did keep him sheltered in this palace. At least he was excited and curious to meet a human, considering the foul attitudes the rest of the elves at the top held. A gaunt and waxy-skinned attendant slipped in beside High Lord Whiteleaf and murmured something about the other guests and of his duties to the kingdom. Whiteleaf's face looked wounded, but he willingly accepted his handling.
"We must talk again, Lord Neversleep,"
High Lord Whiteleaf said with a smile.
"You interest me immensely."
The High Lord was ushered away by his handler and the contingent of guards to greet an endless stream of revellers at the gala. He seemed to comport himself admirably, grinning and greeting his subjects with warmth and affection, but Fraenk read something of the caged Shivan cub in him as well, trotted out before the crowds, made to dance and look winsome. Perhaps even the most powerful elf in the city was also trapped by it as well. Fraenk wanted another glass of that booze, but thought it was best to make sure Farathiel Gingerglade was in sight. Knowing how much he enjoyed licking boots, he was probably waiting for his turn to lap at the leathers of the High Lord. But when Fraenk scanned the crowd, Gingerglade wasn't there talking to the uninterested maidens. Fraenk muttered a curse and struck off across the room. He must be somewhere else in the ballroom. The orchestra had taken a brief pause, but the party was still in full swing. But as he moved around from one side to the other, he couldn't find Gingerglade anywhere. In fact, Fraenk couldn't see any of the Fernbrook guards either. Lord Fernbrook was standing by himself, looking fidgety and irritable near a small plinth displaying an ancient elven vase from the Second Dynasty. The remaining members of the High Council, including Lady Blackroot, were all conversing amiably in a tight group near the High Lord's seat. There was no sign of the remainder of the Fernbrook entourage. They must have used the distraction to slip out when Fraenk was talking to Whiteleaf. Now they were off somewhere else in the palace, most likely retrieving the necklace. He had to find them quickly, but they could be anywhere, and Fraenk didn't have the first clue where to look. He made his way quickly to the doors at the end of the ballroom that looked like they provided access to the rest of the palace, but the moment he approached, the two burly guards stepped politely but firmly into his path.
"Guests must stay in the grand ballroom, sir,"
the larger of the two said, gesturing back the way Fraenk had come. "I was told I could tour the grounds." Fraenk tried knowing before he even said it that the guard was not likely to relent. But if Fernbrook's men had passed this way, they would have had to contend with these guards as well. Fraenk wanted to be sure of their resolve.
"His lord's residence is not a museum, sir."
The second guard was more direct and far less polite. There was no way that Gingerglade and his goons got through this way.
"Why don't you enjoy the drinks and dancing, sir? There's delicacies being served over there,"
the first guard suggested, pointing to a long table where servers were now uncovering an unimaginable array of rich, delicious, bite-sized delicacies. Caramelized silver mushrooms garnished with pinflower, briny radishes soaked in herring head jelly, lamb sausage and fire onions on toasted hard bread, honeyjack jelly braised lake snail skewers, iced cabbage pudding bowls topped with oxblood curd, wide leaves of golan greens with a paste of shadewort berries, which the server assured was not poisonous, because the toxic seeds were all painstakingly removed. Shadewort and golan greens. As Fraenk recalled, that was the exact combination of food used in the botched attempt on Lady Blackroot, one hidden inside the other. Whose idea had that particular dish been? Special request from the Fernbrooks or just an eerie coincidence? Whoever had attempted it, their plan had almost worked. The would-be assassins secreted an unconventional weapon amongst something ordinary as garden vegetables, hiding in plain sight. If only people knew what they were looking for. Then insight hit Fraenk like a fist to the face, and he knew how Lord Fernbrook planned to get the necklace into the party. Fraenk watched the servers with the trays leave, and sure enough, while the other entrances and exits were all under close guard, the servants' entrance down to the kitchens was open and accessible. Perhaps there were guards somewhere down in the kitchens, but the priority seemed to be given to the long string of elves delivering new exotic dishes on silver trays. Fraenk knew he had to get down there, but now that they were in full service, he would look sorely out of place if he tried to slip in amongst them. He noticed how the kitchen servants were all wearing black high-collared outfits, far less flashy but not too dissimilar from his own, only with a white apron cinched to their waist. He quickly scanned the room and noticed an elderly woman drowsing drunkenly on a settee. Her white silken shawl lay beside her on the seat. He quietly slipped in beside her and, when no one was watching, snatched the cloth up behind him. Then it was just a matter of tying it around his waist and ducking into the row of servants who had set down their trays and were now filing back down the stairs. If any of them recognized that Fraenk wasn't one of them, none said anything. As Fraenk suspected, a single guard strode down through the kitchens, but he looked more interested in dipping a finger in and tasting the sweet and savoury sauces than keeping a close eye on the servants. The kitchen was a hot dance of chaos with orders barked and bodies in motion. They were clearly good at what they did, because somehow a steady stream of fresh and steaming trays continued back up the staircase to the ballroom. Fraenk noticed several of the servants wearing billowy white hats that covered their ears, and quickly snagged an unattended one of his own in order to preserve his disguise. "Get those leeches over to Colsuma!" shouted a sweaty, round-bellied elf who was sautéing some cuts of vegetables and meat over searing flames. It took him a moment, but Fraenk realized the man was talking to him. Fraenk had no idea who Colsuma was, but it was best for him to blend in and look obedient. Carefully, he hefted a nearby bucket full of fat black leeches in the direction indicated by the chef's wagging spoon. They writhed, making moist, sucking sounds as he lifted them up, seeming to sense fresh blood nearby. Frank's gorge rose briefly, but he looked away and breathed. What possible unholy dish they were concocting for these vile creatures? Fraenk was sure he didn't want to find out. Elves truly had an odd palate. Sometimes they demanded cuisine of the most pure plants and fungus that nature could offer, and other times, especially when spirits were involved, delving into the depths of culinary depravity. Not that other species were much better. Fraenk had lost more than one of his trained scrates to a hungry human family's cookfire. Kobolds were even less picky, to the point where rats avoided their area entirely. At least the kobolds and humans were honest about it. As Fraenk weaved his way between sweaty bodies of the chefs and servants, he watched as one of the leeches was probing dangerously close to his thumb. Another memory suddenly came to him from childhood. Young Fraenk had just finished a swim in the pond not far from their house. He had felt something odd. There in his armpit, Fraenk discovered a dark, wet body, engorged with blood. And he was screaming for his sister to pull it off, but she too was screaming and wouldn't touch it. He had to run all the way home before his mother could remove the tiny demon. The heat in the room was suddenly too intense. Fraenk was breathing heavily, his vision separating and coming back together. He bumped into the back of an elf who was delicately filleting a white trout. The knife slashed down hard, cutting entirely through the fish. The chef cried out, aggrieved that somehow Fraenk had ruined the entree, but he didn't care. Fraenk moved forward without stopping. Then a glorious fresh breeze brushed his cheek. He panted, taking in the coolness that was somehow fresh and carrying a dizzying array of other scents. Somewhere ahead was an open door to the world. Fraenk slipped around the end of the row of cookfires and past the domed oven where hot loaves of bread were rising. As he passed by one oven, he caught a flash of an image. 2 pairs of children's legs sticking out of the oven's mouth, smoking and black. Fraenk pinched his eyes shut. He could feel the roiling alcohol gurgling in his gut. What was this stuff? He fell back against the kitchen wall, gasping. "Fraenk!" He heard a woman's voice say in his mind, "Keep going, and don't stop." The panic, fear and noise that was boiling in his mind like a steaming cookpot began to settle. He slowly opened his eyes. Everything was much as it was, but somehow he felt like he was different, the way a stone feels in the stream with the water moving all around him. In the midst of the chaos, he was solid. His attention turned to the open doorway to his left that was letting in a gentle breeze, a doorway to the outside, a way for the necklace to get in. Fraenk took a moment to steady himself against the back wall. The kitchen was still a swirling hive, but none seemed to notice him there. He checked back specifically at the elf who had given him the order. He seemed to be in an argument with another elf, both of them shouting and gesticulating with sharp knives in hand. Fraenk took one more glance around, making sure there was no one watching, then slipped back into the hall. There was definitely cool air blowing, like a fresh wind wafting in from outside. Then he heard a rhythmic rumbling and the creaking strain of ropes. Low voices muttering which he couldn't decipher, but carried the tone of illicit, dirty dealings. Fraenk stepped silently as the hallway opened into the dim storeroom. He gave his eyes a moment to adjust. Inside was so full of provisions for the gala, it was downright claustrophobic. There were large barrels of ale, hanging links of sausage and cured ham, crates and boxes full of fresh produce, bottles of spirits, dried ropes of seaweed, bags of grain and flour, and pretty much anything the guests of the young High Lord might desire. As Fraenk had surmised, since the palace was not supplied by large, unsightly carts of goods, rattling endlessly through the elegant main summer palace entrance, it must have some kind of service lift to bring in food and other supplies. That must be what was letting in the air now. Although there were 2 lanterns lit, most of the illumination in the room came from an ethereal blue square of light glowing in the floor. It was a strangely incongruous place, an inverted gateway where it opened into the sky. Of course, the portal was where the elevator platform descended from. It was approximately the size of 2 side-by-side horse carts, with a fat rope that hung down from the heavy winch and pulley system above. One had to admit that it was quite an ingenious design, and best of all, it could only be operated from someone inside the palace, so no potential infiltrators could use the lift to gain access from outside. Fraenk crept into the room for a closer look, realizing he was still carrying the bucket of leeches, but now with no good place to set them down. Then, in one terrifying moment, a man's silhouette stepped out from a stack of crates in front of the hole. His outline was thin and had the unmistakable jester-like puffs at the joints. It was Gingerglade. Fraenk froze in his tracks, not daring to move or breathe. He couldn't tell which direction the elf was facing, until his head tilted and it was clear that he was looking down and out the opening. Fraenk breathed a tight sigh of relief, then slipped behind the ale barrels just to be safe. That was too close. Peering around, he could see one of the Fernbrook guards now working at the elevator's controls, putting tension on the line that controlled the massive counterweight, slowing the ascent of the elevator platform. 2 more of the Fernbrook men were on the other side of the hole, their faces drawn in sharp contrast of pale blue light and heavy shadow.
"Careful, you fool! You're going too fast!"
Gingerglade barked at the man using the controls. He pulled up slightly on the lever to compensate.
"Now that's too slow, idiot!"
The guard at the controls, who Fraenk now recognized as the man who had beaten him bloody a few days ago. Fraenk recalled saving that man's life by keeping him from drowning. Now here he was again, looking ready to beat Gingerglade instead. Fraenk quietly revelled in that idea. Farathiel Gingerglade turned his attention back to the rising platform.
"Do you have it?"
He called down eagerly. Fraenk didn't hear the reply, but judging by Farathiel's reaction, whoever was on the platform did indeed have the necklace. This is it, Fraenk thought. It was a relief to finally know where the mind thief was. Now all he had to do was get it away from his devious nemesis and the complement of guards, which looked to be yet another in a long line of complicated problems, which Fraenk wasn't exactly prepared for. There were some jobs that called for a careful, multiple-step plan, executed with clockwork precision that left your targets wondering how you even pulled it off, ideally with weeks of preparation and lots of accomplices to make sure it executes flawlessly. These were good plans for ideal conditions. The street kid in Fraenk had a much simpler, albeit crude, method for getting his hands on the necklace. Known in the streets as the Alley Rat Special Snatch and Dash. While the Fernbrooks were distracted, Gingerglade still criticizing how the lift operator was still doing it wrong, Fraenk slipped from his hiding place and crept quickly up the aisle. The light in the room began to dim as the platform was nearing the top. The best weapon Fraenk had at the moment was the element of surprise, and also a bucket of leeches, which too would be their own surprise. Then suddenly, a cold prickle crawled up his neck and across his scalp. The instinct he'd formed on the streets and sharpened as a preceptor told him something was amiss. And there he saw it. Rising up from the hole in the floor were 2 black points that quickly became horns. The platform continued to ascend, revealing another of Fraenk's least favourite people in Arathes, ascending from the underworld below like the demon that he was. Sorzan Brimblade, the hell-touched warlock. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for another exciting episode. And remember, the learned scholars of Greysage caution you that the veracity of these events remains unproven. Now go safe in the light of the powers, until our hands clasp again.